Organizations have gotten very anxious about prioritization, and that's another factor driving task overload. It's an intense competitive world, and we can't say no to doing anything. You end up with just too many tasks, and you end up with more things than you can do well or sensibly. We see it most prominently in very large, very complex organizations, but interdependency requires so many people to touch each piece of work. That becomes exhausting, that becomes complex, that's intensified work. Why do I have to go through 17 committees to make a decision?
The first step to get out of your comfort zone is to drill down on how you're adding value. And when you can say, I'm adding value because of my ability to connect people, it frees your brain to then not have to know everything else. You rely on that strength. Start with what you're good at. All right, then what?
You need to figure out how you can be eye of the storm, calm, centered, and not constantly get knocked off track by that chaotic individual.
What you're advocating for is to think about how you respond. I can't control what the markets are doing. I can't control what our customers might be experiencing and going through. I can't control a natural disaster that impacts my business, but I can control how I respond.
Yeah.
The chaos at work, the chaos in your life, the chaos in the world at large. Those are making work harder for focus, harder to figure out what to do, what's effective. So what are your tactics? Where do you help people get started in this journey to be effective?
Some of it is we need to be able to understand.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. Okay, let me tell you something you don't know for today. The pressure is on. The demands on your time and attention are probably unrelenting. There's enormous fears about AI, right, left, and center, from how do I use it to will I still have a job? The team expects an incredible amount of their time and energy, probably more so than any other time in history, and everything feels chaotic and out of control. So given that state of affairs, what do you do to make sure that you're being effective? One of my absolute favorite words, and delivering work that matters, that has an impact. Those are the watchwords for me. So my guest today is Melissa Swift. She's a leading voice on how organizations, teams, and individuals can succeed in an ever more challenging world of work. She's got 2 bestsellers. One is called, the one we're talking about today is Effective, How to Do Great World and Work in a Fast-Changing World. Her prior book, which was award-winning, is Work Here Now. Member of MIT Sloan Management Review editorial board, one of their most widely read columnists, often quoted in all the publications I care about. Melissa, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I'm really excited for today's discussion.
I am super excited about it. And I have to tell you, I love the book title, Effective, because if you were to look at my proposals for the last 18 years, there are 2 words that show up over and over and over again in titles, effective and navigate. How do we navigate all the obstacles so that we're effective? And I just love that you've called the book Effective. I also happen to like the book. So I'm excited to talk about it. All right, so let's get grounded. There are 4 trends that you're really focused on that you think are really driving work. What are those trends?
Yeah, so they are, in no particular order. Work intensification, which is task overload or excess interdependency. Excess emotion at work, which is actually kind of a subset of work intensification as researchers define it, but actually it deserved its own chapter because there's a lot going on there. Hyper-transparency, we work in workplaces where all data floats around everywhere and everyone seems to know everything and there's lots of information and half of it's wrong. So that's a very interesting one. And then chaos, pure chaos.
So chaos is just not any one person's organization. Everybody is dealing with chaos.
as in, when's the decision going to be made? What's going to happen next? The decision got reversed. How many more checks and balances? That sort of chaos.
Absolutely. And there's also, external chaos too, right? We have a lot of stuff going on geopolitically and economically. And, you take that external chaos, you add it to the normal, chaos that people have going on in their personal lives. I think particularly for, millennials or Gen Xers, where you've got that squeeze generation thing going on, where we're caring for kids and we're caring for aging parents as well. So that's inherently chaotic. And then you've got, to your point, the actual chaos of the way organizations run, which is we're kind of at a high water mark, I believe, right now for that.
My friends and I who have adult children, this is across a lot of different friends, are amazed at how chaotic their lives are. But I think it's just so much to do. There's so much at work to do. There's so much to do on Slack channels with your friends and trying to stay up and connected. There's, if you've got young children, there's school activities and there's other parents to connect with and there's birthday parties. And it just feels like it's a never ending thing that feels more chaotic than I remember at that stage. So empathy. I want to come back to the very beginning, though. You said intensification, both from work overload, but also from interdependencies. That's a trend I've been thinking about for a while, but say what you are seeing in the overload and the interdependencies.
Yeah. So, the task overload part it's kind of exactly what you were just alluding to, but the work version that, we simply, I think, and partly because of technology, uh, there's this ability to just layer on and layer on literally more things to do. And it feels like you can, right? You can send an email to your direct report with here's 17 things I want you to do. You can have 20 Teams chats open and ping it. You can have all of that going. And organizations have gotten very, I think, anxious about prioritization. And that's another factor driving task overload is that, when it's an intense competitive world and, we can't say no to doing anything, then you end up with just too many tasks and you end up with more things than you can do well or sensibly. The other piece, interdependency, I think is really, really interesting because it's not just, we see it most prominently in very large, very complex organizations, but it's interesting how quickly it pops up even in smaller ones, that just the way we work today, it requires so many people to touch each piece of work that, again, that becomes exhausting, that becomes complex, that's intensified work. And, you feel it. I mean, I always cite the great Jamie Dimon rant about why do I have to go through 17 committees to make a decision? So if the CEO of a very large organization is feeling somehow impinged upon by interdependency, well, how do the rest of us feel? Not good.
Yeah, I think this one is way overlooked, this interdependency, because I don't think we stop to map how many people have to have a hand in what I'm doing. A check and balances hand for good reason that was intended, want to have a say in that. We've gotten collaboration overload as people have written about. I just think that interdependence, if we stop to map it, we would say, oh my gosh, because I think that is tripling the number of meetings that we have to do. And there goes my time. Okay, the last one I want to pick on is this hyper transparency, because there's a recent research that we've talked about on this podcast that people younger generations are expecting more transparency. There's more free flowing information everywhere, whether you intended it or not. And as you said, right, whether it's accurate or not. So there's this need to be super transparent. Otherwise, there goes your trust. There goes your credibility. There goes a whole bunch of other things. But tell me what you're seeing.
I think it's a delicate balance because we're in a more transparent world. I mean, the expectation of transparency is kind of a fair one, right? When we're in a world where, public figures make their every, utterance, they put it out there every 2 seconds. It's no longer, carefully scripted speeches and all of that, that it is a different world and it is fair to have that expectation. I think where things go wrong is that there are things still, in this life that we shouldn't necessarily be fully transparent about. So, for example, if you may know as a senior leader that you're about to have a reduction in force. You may know layoffs are coming. You cannot, and often for legal reasons, you cannot just go around ad hoc communicating that to everyone, and that makes sense. And there's a role for more formal, scripted, modulated communications. But that's not to your point, that's not the expectation in today's world. And the other issue is with hyper transparency. Somebody might see on social media, oh, well, here's a little video of these executives going into this conference room, and I think they're going to do layoffs. That's the other problem in the hyper transparent world is information gets to people accidentally in the wrong form through the wrong channels. And as a leader, again, it can feel like being on a bucking bronco trying to manage that.
Right. And it happens faster, not in the way you wanted, inaccurate. All right. So 410 for trends, intensification, which is both the overload as well as the interdependencies, the emotional overburden, people expecting more from you, the hyper transparent world, things get out in ways you hadn't intended, and just the chaos at work, the chaos in your life, the chaos in the world at large. Okay. Those are making work harder for focus, harder to figure out what to do, what's effective. So what are your tactics? Where do you help people get started in this journey to be effective?
Well, I think some of it is we need to be able to understand what we're good at. If you think about it, the central thesis of this book is that there's just an inherent worth in doing your job well. And that there's an inherent value as leaders to getting our teams doing our job. And there's an inherent value as organizations of everybody doing their job. This super basic thing about work that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. So what makes you good at your job? And what I talk about in the book is it's basically, 4 things. And some of us have a lot of one and a little of another. Some of us are more evenly, but it's basically, it's either your knowledge, right? You're kind of like, you got the geeky thing going. That's me, by the way. I'm a geek, right? I'm all about, I read the latest research study, your methods, where you're a really amazing operator. And methods, people have interesting careers because a lot of times they'll get plucked from a role over here and put in a role over here just because they're kind of good at problem solving. They're good at sorting things out. You could be just really good with people. And that's an interesting one because at the lower level, it's just kind of being a good communicator and understanding folks really well. At the higher level, and actually a couple of people who I interviewed for the book fit this description, people actually turn into super connectors where they have this amazing sort of encyclopedia of all the people they know in their brain. And they go, oh, this person should meet that person. That's what the highest level of being good with people looks like. And then finally, you might be just really good with technology. That's kind of the 4th vector. And that 4th vector, I think, right now we're over-rotating a little bit. The AI conversation is all about how we all need to be extremely good with technology. And no, you need all 4.
All right. So I've got some sort of content task specific knowledge. I've got methodology knowledge. I've got people knowledge, and I've got technology knowledge. And knowledge is probably the wrong word. It's skills. It's capability. Yeah. It's the ability, as one of my colleagues just say, it's the know-how of getting things in that area done. And you rely on that strength. One of the things I know, Melissa, from my work, from this podcast, Out of the Comfort Zone, I promise you that the first step to get out of your comfort zone is to drill down on how you're adding value. And when you can say, I'm adding value because of my ability to connect people, it frees your brain to then not have to know everything else. You rely on that strength. But you got to start there. If you don't, then you tie yourself in knots about what you're not good at and how you're not, and you can't get out of your comfort zone. So I love that you start that. In this chaos, this crazy world, start with what you're good at. All right, then what?
Well, then I think you have to do, a bit of diagnosis as to actually what's going on around you and take a step back from the overwhelm and say, okay, is the problem, excess emotion? Is the problem chaos? If it's chaos, which kind? There's 2 kinds of chaos, right? There's the natural chaos of the world, and that just is what it is. That crazy things happen and people are unpredictable and blah, blah. Then there's actually when folks are operating chaotically. And that's a different set of strategies. And that's more around guarding your boundaries and not letting other people's chaos kind of knock you off your train tracks.
Okay.
It's interesting because sometimes you see leaders who are, I think of as chaos as a strategy, but they are consciously or subconsciously almost deliberately chaotic because it makes them kind of the main character. That they're like in there making all the statements and things are crazy, and then everyone has to react. And if you're dealing with someone like that in your immediate circle, you need to figure out how you can be eye of the storm, calm, right, centered, just and not constantly get knocked off track by that chaotic individual. That's a really different set of strategies than, okay, well, the business is just crazy.
Yeah. Fair enough. I can't control what the markets are doing. I can't control what our customers might be experiencing and going through. I can't control a natural disaster that impacts my business. But I can control how I respond. And I think what you're advocating for is to think about how you respond. So I'll bite. Let's say I have a chaotic manager, and maybe it's a manager's manager even, who's just chaotic and gets multiple people working on different aspects of things, doesn't coordinate them very well, doesn't communicate very well what they're looking for, and it creates a lot of emotional spin as well as unnecessary work. All right. What's your advice for how I navigate that person and stay calm?
Yeah, so I'll steal a bit of wonderful advice from one of the folks that I interviewed for the book, Dimitris Bontolas, who's the CIO of Ferrovial, a company you may or may not have heard of. But if you've seen the gigantic renovation project at JFK Airport, they're the ones doing that, right? So they do just inherently, these giant capital projects, just an inherently chaotic business, right? But he gave a piece of advice that I think is highly applicable to dealing with chaotic individuals, actually, which is figure out what you want to protect. And I really like that because the way my brain is wired, I want everything to go well, right? I got the classic, like it's almost like a mom thing, like the snacks have to be arranged nicely and everyone has to be happy and everyone has to have a towel for the pool. I get that at work too. But his advice was, okay, what can't get touched by chaos? What absolutely has to be protected? And pour all of your energy into protecting that. And I love that. It's very freeing to say, okay, well, you know what? This part of the project's really messy and it's going to be messy and I'm going to let it go. But this piece is what's really crucial. This is what's really essential. This is, what's going in front of the client, right? I'm going to put all of my energy into making sure that's not as dramatically impacted by that chaotic individual. And that advice, as soon as I heard it, it really resonated for me. I said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's made me think about my day-to-day very differently about what has to be protected and what's allowed to go a little wrong.
I find this, so I give this advice all the time to leaders who are struggling to turn over work to their team. Okay. The team is going to make mistakes. They're not going to do it with a level of perfection that you might be able to do it. They're not going to spot the errors the way you might be able to spot it. Okay. It's inevitable, but they're not going to learn either if they don't have some opportunity. And I often say you have to figure out what aspect of this work can't go wrong. And it's a little tiny bit of the work that you just got to identify. Like the final report can't have a flaw in the data analytics because it's going to the board, for example. Okay, it'll get spotted. That's the thing that you have to protect, but that means that there's a dozen other things you can let go of in the process. I just think we don't think enough about what's the one thing, two things that I need to be all over.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's because our ambitions have kind of gotten ahead of us. So I think about an instance many years ago where we were about to turn in 100+ slide deliverable to the client. And it was a team I was kind of working with, but I was doing a bit for them. I was sort of like a subject matter expert. And I said, hey guys, I'm a fresh pair of eyes. You want me to proofread this? I'm happy to just take an hour and proofread this. And I found an error on almost every page. And this was about to go to very senior stakeholders, very, very senior. And what made me think about it was, if you had a 10-page deliverable, it's a lot less likely that it would be so kind of typo-ridden or error-ridden, right? It was the scale and complexity of what was being attempted that drove that kind of critical flaw. Like that's, you can't have typos in something going to like, CEOs of major companies. It's not okay. To your point, that's the little piece that has to be right. But I think sometimes, again, because we're so technologically enabled at this point that our eyes are bigger than our stomach. And we are trying to do things sometimes at a scale and complexity that if we dialed back and it focused on, what is the right end result, it would then engineer a working process that didn't feel as, kind of like, the white knuckle on the steering wheel.
Sure. Yeah. At the same time, there is this complexity. I know, and there's a tendency to say, well, AI should clear that up. But I actually find most of my typos are created by AI, not the other way around. So,
Yeah. I mean, the model I use, I just looked at the reporting out of Stanford. The model I use of AI that I use every day is at 66% hallucinations. 2/3 of the time it's hallucinating, right? So that doesn't mean I don't use it. I use it every day. But it means, to your point, I'm checking it much more stringently than I would check a human worker's work, honestly.
yeah. That's an interesting one. I make a comment about AI, and then I want to return to some tactics on how to deal with these trends. And I know you've written a lot about AI and have a lot of thoughts about AI. Everybody's worried that AI is going to take their job away. I'm worried about the polar opposite. It's going to do exactly what you've been describing, and that is going to layer on additional things. I now have to layer on checking that I didn't have to do before. I now have to layer on a perfection in a document formatting because in theory, I can do that with AI. So why don't I do, ante that up? I can layer on a research check and research depth that might not have done because it took too many hours in the prior. There's just going to be so many higher standards for ideal. I think it's going to add work, not reduce work.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing in early studies. I think there are a couple of professors that put out a report that said, yeah, it's creating more layers of work. To your point, it's changing the expectations without actually, I think, changing the quality of many things. That's what's a bit, eerie, right? Is that it's not like, when we went from typewriters to computers where we could, revise on the screen before we printed. Yeah, typos went down, right? Because it wasn't, every time you screwed up a key. But this isn't exactly that. We haven't actually made that gigantic of a leap. It just optically feels like we have because of the way the outputs of this technology are constructed. And that's a dangerous moment to my eye.
Right. Okay. So we talked about chaos as one of the trends. We talked about understanding where your real strengths are, what your value add is, the thing that you're going to lean on. We talked about diagnosing the problem. So is the problem just something that happens in the natural world, or is this chaos caused by a person who has a different style? Let's take a different one. Let's take this notion of intensification and particularly interdependence. What's your advice on how people deal with that trend?
This is such an interesting one to me because it's such an insidious trend. And the reality is you can't fix oftentimes the underlying causes of it, right? You're not going to personally unwind your organization's bureaucracy. Right. What you can do, this is so interesting. I did some research last year. And what we found in that study was that people who are able to work more independently, right, just are a lot less overwhelmed. And so the challenge is, even in highly interdependent environments, can you personally figure out ways of working more independently, which I think is doable. I think that is an achievable goal. It's just that for many of us, that goal is almost countercultural. Like, we're supposed to collaborate. What do you mean work more independently? Are you some kind of like weird lone wolf? Which, by the way, is not even true of wolves, right? They're highly social animals. They mate for life. They're pack driven, right? Wolves aren't lone wolves, but this goal of saying, actually, and I've done this in my consulting career. I've said, actually, guys, I need to get out of this like brainstorm. Let me go work on this subset of slides, and then let me come back to you. Because that's the thing. It's the figure eight collaboration, right? Come together, go away and work independently. Like let your independent brains work on it, then come back together and talk about what you've worked on. That's far more, effective than everybody kind of like sitting in the same room staring at each other the whole time, and not getting kind of what you would think of as any individual's finished thoughts.
Okay. I like that. I do think that there is a knee-jerk reaction at the moment that says, I can't do this by myself. I can't do anything by myself. I have to have somebody else. Then I have a coordination effort. Then I have a timing problem. Then I have, we meet to get organized. It ends up taking up enormous amount of times to try to work with somebody. As opposed to each of us got our own ideas about what need to happen. We come together, compare notes, agree, disagree, debate, divide, go back, come back together. That away work, together work seems, like you describe in the figure 8, seems to me a much more efficient way of getting things done. And that's what you're advocating for.
Absolutely. And I want to pull on one of the threads that you mentioned, which I think is really, really important, which is this piece about being able to actually constructively debate. Because I think what happens when we're over collaborated is we almost debate too early. And a lot of good ideas get sort of, strangled in their crib or just really quashed when they're just at initial idea stage. Whereas, to your point, if you go away and get the idea a little bit more finished, and then you can have that constructive clash about the right way to do things, that, kind of like clashing too early as opposed to clashing a bit later. Clashing a bit later is a far more constructive and often, collegial conversation, as opposed to, if people sort of shout you down too early in the cycle, a lot of times you end up with people who are quietly seething, and they're fair to feel that way, right? And
right.
Again, if you want productive collaboration, you have to let people kind of do a little building on their own.
Right. Fair enough. Well, we also know from brainstorming research that the worst possible brainstorming strategy is bring everybody together and say, now everybody come up with ideas. What you get is a subset of the ideas that you would have gotten. Much smarter to say, everybody sit quietly and think for yourself, or think for yourself before you come to the meeting. Then we can debate how do ideas combine, not combine, and so on. And when I've gotten a little bit of evidence, a little bit fleshed out on an idea, I think I'm more willing to hear the criticisms because I'm beginning to see the flaws in it. Or I'm ready to polish it in a way that it was just an idea, could you not shoot it before we get some flesh on the bones there?
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I was in a brainstorm once where my boss was actually the scribe. She was writing the ideas on the board, and she found my ideas so weird. I watched her physically not write them up. Like, she wouldn't even record them. And to your point, that's what happens sometimes, right?
Dismissive. Yeah.
Dismissive. Yeah. And then people feel dismissed. And the spikiest, most interesting ideas, the ones that actually need the constructive debate of the group, don't even make it out of the gate.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm having run hundreds of brainstorming events for clients in a variety of different ways. 90% of the time, the wild, wacky one is the spark that creates something that we actually end up going with. But if you kill that too early, you don't have that grist for thinking differently. Anyway, it's easy to do in a brainstorming when I'm trying to be efficient as opposed to effective. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this whole notion of the chaos, and if somebody's operating chaotically, getting focused on the one thing that you can't afford to go wrong, that you do need to protect, whether that's personally or work-wise. We've got this notion of interdependence, the figure 8 collaboration. So we work independently, then we come together for collaboration and debate, and then we work independently and come back together for collaboration and debate. So that gets rid of some of the interdependence. Okay. What about the overload? What's your advice for people dealing with overload?
Number one, start with your own house first. So if you have too many tasks, figure out if any of those tasks are self-assigned. I know that sounds silly, but we all assign more work to ourselves than we necessarily pick up on. So, is any of the overload self-driven? Have I decided these things need to happen, and do they need to happen? And then, potentially some of the things you've decided need to happen actually should trump some of the stuff that got assigned to you. It actually might be more important because you're closer to the work. But, at that point, you have to, it's a series of conversations with both, your manager, but also, people who work laterally to you. One of the most interesting phenomenons in organizations that I've seen in some ways is that work kind of goes to the wrong people a lot of the time. And if you've got kind of people in peer roles or adjacent roles, actually sitting down and doing a little swap meet of, okay, I've got this on my plate. You've got this on your plate. Am I the person who should be doing this? Are you the person who should be doing this? And particularly if you have peers that you work really well with and you can do it in kind of an ego free, finger pointing free way, a lot of times you may feel less overloaded if you are doing all the right tasks as opposed to doing somebody else's job for them, which can be a huge source of frustration.
Yeah. Yeah. And create interdependency and create emotional overload and a whole bunch of other stuff along the way. I often say to people, particularly in the mid ranks in career, where your boss assigned you a task. Assigned means I want the task done. I want you to make sure it's done. It does not mean you need to do it. So debate who needs to be involved? How do they involve? Who owns a piece of this? And again, is there a divide and conquer strategy, that figure 8 approach that you're describing, useful here? Will this move us along faster?
Absolutely.
All right. We're on a roll. So I have to ask about hyper-transparency. What's your advice? Because the world is not stopping the transparency thing. It's going.
I'm going to cite another wonderful person I interviewed for the book, Tausif Rahman, who's a workplace consultant from Mercer, a former colleague of mine and brilliant guy, had, this kind of metaphor that I really liked and ended up expanding upon. So in his metaphor, if somebody says, I'm going to come over. Oh, yeah, sure, come over. Well, I'm right outside your house. Oh, gosh. And you're frantically tidying up. So this is the hyper-transparent world. If you keep your house basically clean, then it's easy to have people over at any moment.
Right.
So some of it is not the transparency part. It's are you doing things that make sense? Are you doing things that are ethical and logical? Are you, treating people properly? All of these kind of basics, getting the basics right behind the scenes. Then when you have these moments of even unwanted transparency, then, you're okay. I mean, if let's say it's the equivalent of getting caught on, a hot mic, when they leave your microphone on by accident,
right.
If you're not a jerk, maybe you get caught on a hot mic saying something nice, but things have to be okay behind the scenes. My expansion on Tausif's already terrific metaphor is think about what kind of house is easiest to keep clean. If you've got knickknacks everywhere and all these little, tchotchkes. It's hard to keep it clean, right? You're dusting all the time and you're rearranging and every surface is covered with stuff. Whereas if you have this lovely minimalist house, right? It's basically cleans itself. It's super simple to keep it clean. And again, in a hyper-transparent world, if you've got 20 million things going on behind the scenes and, you're very involved in office politics, and there's all these little intrigues and you got all this stuff going on, when moments of transparency come, it looks messy as heck. As opposed to if you've got a few simple things that you are doing in a clean and clear way, hyper-transparency is not that hard.
Right. I also think you put value in the bank account by having kept things clean, having treated people fairly, so that if something does leak, you got a little bit of grace to say, well, I didn't handle that well, or, well, that isn't quite what I was intended, or some other version of that thing. You just have a little grace. But if you haven't handled people well up until that point in time, that can be a hard one to recover from.
Absolutely. And there's also, you have to manage people's expectations that, yeah, come on in, but the place might be, we just had some kids over, the place might be a little messy. I've had that conversation, particularly with junior folks, because people come into the workplace with very idealistic expectations. And, you say, okay, compensation processes are not a perfect meritocracy. Right. I am going to have to do some horse trading behind the scenes. The outcomes might not be perfect. This is a little bit of how the sausage gets made in organizations, and being fairly honest with people about, if you open the hallway closet, a basketball might fall on your head, because that's what the hallway closet's like.
Yeah. Well, and understanding, often think if people, particularly younger staff, understand how the organization tries to make decisions, they realize that there's a lot more that goes into those decisions than they thought on the surface. And therefore, lots of other places where things could be misinterpreted and going wrong.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, I've said for ages, and you know this research also from Mercer, if you're not fair to people, if you don't treat people fairly, then transparency will come back to bite you.
Oh,
But
yeah, absolutely.
and it's easier said than done sometimes unintentionally. Okay, what else do we need to know? What is your other top pieces of advice that you would give us on being effective?
I would say, understand when you're in a situation where you cannot be effective. Again, and this is something that, people who are really passionate about their work and good at it are particularly prone to this, is the work version of I can fix him, that I can come into any role and I can make it work. No, absolutely not. And so there's a whole chapter on this in Effective. And I interviewed a bunch of brilliant organizational consultants who look at things like, what does a properly constructed job look like? You may have an improperly constructed job. That doesn't mean you go quit. It just means that you need to address your job rather than, people will sit there and audit the heck out of their own behavior and desperately contort themselves and exhaust themselves. And I'm not saying don't do the work on yourself. It always starts with the work on yourself. But I do think part of self-awareness is realizing when there is a structural thing you cannot fight. And figuring out there's a wall right here. Okay, do I climb over it? Do I go around it? But I cannot go through it.
Right. And not try. Stop trying to beat yourself up because you can't suddenly move that wall. It is a structural feature of the job that you have next. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. I have to ask you one last question, because one of the things I'm fascinated by in this book is that you talk to people where a mistake is unacceptable because it costs lives, like a firefighter. So this is not most of our jobs. Most of the time, a mistake is not going to cost anything dramatic. So what did you learn in talking to people like firefighters?
This was so interesting because my hypothesis was, I think these guys do work differently. And you know what? They do. They absolutely do. That in the business world, a lot of times, this always shocked me in consulting, that every time we got an RFP in, it was like the first time we got an RFP, what are we going to do? In high stakes jobs, the degree of routinization is through the roof. You always, you got a guy rappelling down the side of a building, right? A burning building. You always do it the same way. Triage in an emergency room. You always do it the same way. You always, if you're an air traffic controller, you have to prioritize the planes that are landing over the planes that are taking off, because the ones that are landing are vulnerable. They're in the air. That principle alone, if we applied that principle in business situations of what are the vulnerable planes in the air as opposed to the ones that can wait a minute to take off, we would do things very, very differently. And I really just got absolutely fascinated with ways of working that, again, they almost sound weird to us, like, oh, it's not very creative to do the same things the same way every time. But actually doing things the same way every time frees up the brain space for the moment when you need to get creative, right? When there's a sudden tornado or whatever, so, a large car accident comes into the ER or a part of the building blows up, people who do high stakes work keep a lot of their brains free for that stuff. And that's something we would all do well to mimic.
Totally. Not reinventing it every single time, having a process for the routine things that we do and not deviating, because that takes, you're right, that takes the mental load off and it takes the emotional load off.
Yeah.
So that probably would also solve some of our interdependencies and overload if we adopted a little bit more of what is routine here and how do we make this systematically the same each time. Melissa, what a great conversation. So many insights in this book. I just absolutely love it. My guest today, Melissa Swift. The book is called Effective: How to Do Great World in a Fast-Changing World. And as you can see from this, it's a series of interviews with a whole range of people in lots of different jobs focused around 4 key trends that we've been talking about: the intensification from work overload and from interdependence, the emotional overburden of everybody, the hyper-transparency, welcome to social media, and the chaos in the world at large, as well as the chaos we all impose on it. And what do you do to stay calm, continue to add value, and ultimately to be effective. So what a great book. Melissa, I love it.
Thank you so much. This was a fun conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And if somebody wanted to reach out to you, where should they go to find you?
I'm very available on LinkedIn, my company website, anthrominsight.com, and I'm growing a presence on TikTok and Instagram.
Fabulous. All right, Melissa Swift, and the book is called Effective. Thank you very much. And if you want to watch this episode, check out our YouTube channel at Out of the Comfort Pod, and definitely tune in next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone. See you then.